They looked like the picture-perfect American dream, smiling, singing, and riding in that brightly painted bus. But behind the screen, the glossy image of harmony masked an entirely different truth. While fans adored the Partridge family for its light-hearted charm, one of its brightest stars was quietly distancing herself, not out of vanity, but from wounds she carried in silence. The biggest surprise? Susan Day's absence from the reunion wasn't due to time or forgetfulness. It was because of him, the one co-star she once admired most. In 1970, everything changed for television, and for Susan. At just 17, a former teenage model with barely any acting experience, she suddenly became the face of Laurie Partridge, a role that made her a household name almost overnight. Her beauty was disarming, but it was her calm, graceful presence that captured America's heart. Her portrayal of Laurie felt effortless, and viewers couldn't get enough. She wasn't just a character on screen. She became a symbol of youthful innocence, and suddenly girls wanted to be her, while parents trusted her image. The show exploded into a pop culture phenomenon. From lunchboxes to posters and songs that stormed the charts, the Partridge Family wasn't just a show, it was a movement. Susan's face was everywhere. Yet, as the spotlight intensified, a different version of Susan lived quietly behind the curtain. One that was never shown in glossy magazine spreads or interviews. As her fame snowballed, so did the pressure to remain flawless. She was playing a role not just on set, but in real life. Laurie Partridge was sunny, wholesome, and simple. But Susan Day? She was growing up fast under a microscope. Her every gesture became a headline. And while the series promised laughs and song-filled adventures, the backstage world was a completely different rhythm. There, emotions ran high. Not every smile was genuine, and not every bond was as tight-knit as the show would have you believe. Even with David Cassidy, the show's golden boy and Susan's on-screen brother, things weren't as sweet as they looked. Cassidy always claimed the cast was like a real family, full of support and shared memories. He spoke fondly of his connection with Shirley Jones and Danny Bonaduce, and said Susan was like a sister. But real families have friction, and behind their carefully rehearsed lines, unspoken tensions simmered. Susan, a naturally quiet and reflective teenager, found herself at odds with the pressures of Hollywood. She and David might have had a strong on-screen bond, but off-camera their dynamic was far more complicated. While Cassidy leaned into his fame, embracing his heartthrob status with confidence, Susan was withdrawing. The more famous they became, the more she felt isolated. And as their public profiles soared, so did the invisible gap between them. Their differences weren't loud. They didn't argue. But something unspoken lingered. Emotional weight that made eye contact feel heavier. That made certain silences between takes feel just a little too long. It was never made public then, but those subtle cracks would widen over the years. What most people never saw was Susan's deeper struggle, the kind of conflict that doesn't erupt, but builds slowly in private. She was navigating real emotions, confusion, admiration, and a growing affection for David Cassidy that went far beyond professional respect. It wasn't puppy love. This wasn't a teenage fantasy. She truly cared for him, perhaps more than she ever let on. They shared private moments, glances between scenes, whispered jokes no one else understood. But that connection was one-sided. David, charming and fully aware of the spotlight that followed him, kept his guard up. He knew any hint of romance could shatter the carefully curated image of their show. And Susan, still figuring out who she was behind the fame, couldn't find the words to explain how she really felt. She watched him soak up the adoration of fans, watched him pose, perform, smile, and still, something inside her clung to the bond they shared. It wasn't about fame or fandom. It was about two young people lost in the whirlwind of sudden success, one of them trying to hold on to something real, Susan's emotions never reached the tabloids. They never became part of the scripted interviews or publicity tours. But those feelings stayed with her. Quietly. Deeply. And they played a part in why she never looked back at the Partridge family the way others did. Years later, when the idea of a reunion was floated around, fans expected excitement. But Susan declined, without drama, without a grand statement. Just a quiet, resolute no. And that no said everything. Not because she hated the show, but because for her, returning would mean reopening doors she worked hard to close. Beneath the glitter of teen stardom and the sound of sing-alongs was a young woman who struggled to separate her identity from a character the world refused to let go of. Lori Partridge was a role, but Susan Dey had her own story, more fragile, more human, and far more compelling than anyone knew. David Cassidy, with all his charm and easy charisma, had a way of lighting up every room, especially when Susan Dey was in it. But behind that spark, he kept a careful distance. Though they shared countless moments that could have blossomed into something more, David chose restraint. He later admitted it was intentional. He feared that anything romantic might unravel the carefully curated image of their show and complicate an already delicate dynamic. For Susan, this ambiguity was tormenting. There was never an outright dismissal, no clear rejection, just a silence that hung between them like unspoken dialogue. That quiet gap, over time, grew into something heavier. She never said the words aloud, but the ache was real. And instead of confronting it, she poured herself into her work, putting on a polished front while concealing the weight of feelings that had nowhere to go. Fame offered no refuge from the emotional limbo she quietly endured. What they shared, though never fully defined, lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. David would come to symbolize a chapter of Susan's life that was filled with yearning, admiration, and unanswered questions. She moved on, at least outwardly. But some stories remain half-written, especially when the other half chooses to speak for both. Years passed. The bright lights of the Partridge family dimmed into TV history, a relic of the 70s now packaged in reruns and old fan magazines. Susan, determined to break free from Lori Partridge's lingering shadow, pushed herself into dramatic roles that felt heavier, more real. While she evolved, David remained caught in the orbit of his teen idol fame, the same stardom that once made him a sensation now tethering him to the past. Then, in 2007, everything shifted. David released his autobiography, Could It Be Forever? A tell-all that promised candor, and it delivered more than anyone expected. Inside its pages, amid the glitz and backstage secrets, one passage caught fire. He claimed he and Susan had once spent a night together during the peak of their fame. It wasn't detailed, it wasn't even fully explained, but its inclusion hit like a thunderclap. That single revelation unraveled years of quiet. For David, it may have been just a memory, just another anecdote. But for Susan, it felt like betrayal. She had spent decades carefully separating herself from that identity, shielding pieces of herself that were too tender to expose. Now, a private moment, one she had never publicly acknowledged, was on full display. This wasn't nostalgia. This was exposure. And it didn't come with an apology or warning. It came tucked between celebrity gossip and long-forgotten tour stories. Suddenly, a wound Susan had long buried had been reopened for everyone to see. She never responded publicly. No interviews, no counters, no quotes. But sometimes silence is the loudest response of all. Her decision to stay quiet wasn't passive. It was intentional. And it was final. From that moment on, Susan and David's paths no longer crossed. Not in reunions, not in interviews, not in passing mentions. The invisible thread that once tied them had snapped. But long before that book stirred headlines, Susan had already begun rewriting her own story. When the show ended in 1974, she stood at a personal crossroads. The world knew her as the sweet, soft-spoken teen from a hit sitcom. But Susan wasn't interested in being a relic. She wanted substance, and she chased it. Her transformation came through the courtroom drama L.A. Law, where she played the formidable Grace Van Owen. This wasn't the naive Laurie Partridge anymore. This was a woman with layers, ambition, and agency. Susan's performance wasn't just impressive, it was groundbreaking. She won acclaim, awards, and the validation that she could carry serious roles without being boxed in by her past. A Golden Globe followed, and so did new opportunities. She had emerged from the shadows of teen stardom and stepped fully into her own. By the 1990s, as nostalgia surged and fans clamored for a Partridge Family reunion, Susan's absence was unmistakable. VH1 offered specials. ABC floated reunion episodes. Castmates showed interest. But Susan? She said nothing. Not a word. And that silence turned heads. While others leaned into the opportunity to relive their glory days, Susan remained still. Her refusal wasn't bitterness. It was boundary. The Partridge Family wasn't just a job to her. It was a chapter that carried both joy and private pain. And revisiting it on cue for the sake of ratings wasn't an option. In a world where celebrities often trade privacy for publicity, Susan made a different choice. Her silence wasn't a retreat. It was a stance. She had built a life beyond the TV screen, beyond Laurie, beyond David. And in choosing to stay away, she reclaimed her story. The one no one else had the right to tell. She was once America's sweetheart, poised, graceful, effortlessly radiant on screen. But Susan Day's deliberate disappearance from the Partridge Family reunions wasn't born from fading interest or a reclusive lifestyle. It was rooted in something far more personal, something raw. What really drove her silence wasn't just history, it was betrayal. And the name behind that betrayal? David Cassidy. The world had always speculated, but now, insiders are piecing together the full picture. And it's more devastating than anyone imagined. She didn't vanish from the spotlight because of fame fatigue. Susan's absence was an act of self-protection, a response to a wound carved deeply and publicly. Years after their shared time on set, Cassidy made a choice that shattered the bond between them. He took a private memory, something she believed was theirs alone, and broadcasted it to the world in his autobiography. A single sentence that changed everything. For him, it may have been a passing anecdote. For her, it was a violation, not just of trust, but of something sacred. When his book hit the shelves, Susan was blindsided. A moment once buried in private history was now fair game for tabloids, interviews, and fan speculation. He'd turned something intimate into a public footnote. No warning, no remorse. That's when she drew her line in the sand. Reunite with the man who turned her vulnerability into a headline? Never. Imagine standing on a stage, smiling for fans, beside the very person who made your pain part of his plotline. That's the impossible choice Susan Day was expected to make. But she didn't bend. While others cashed in on nostalgia, Susan chose dignity over performance. She didn't want applause, she wanted peace. And in a world hungry for happy endings and reunion specials, Susan gave us something even more powerful. A silent stand against exploitation disguised as sentiment. Then came November 2017. David Cassidy passed away, and the world turned its gaze back to the golden era of family sitcoms. Social media exploded with tributes. Tears flowed. Old clips resurfaced. But there was one voice missing from the chorus of mourning, Susan's. She didn't post a photo. She didn't grant an interview. And that silence echoed louder than any eulogy. It wasn't indifference. It was a choice. For years, she had avoided revisiting the wounds, and she wasn't about to let a public tragedy undo the boundaries she'd fought to preserve. As networks rushed to produce retrospectives and documentaries, and former co-stars tearfully remembered the good times, Susan remained invisible. She wasn't bitter. She was simply done. In a culture that celebrates revival and resurrections, she was one of the few who understood the power of walking away and staying away. Every reunion rumor that made headlines, she turned down. Every invitation to reflect on the good old days declined, because for her, those days weren't good. They were complicated, painful, and steeped in betrayal. Yet she never lashed out, never gave interviews that pointed fingers or stirred drama. She let her silence speak. In that silence was a profound message. Some chapters aren't meant to be reopened. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is not show up. While many focused on Cassidy's legacy of charm and music, fewer examined the ripple effects of his decisions. His fame had a price, one that others, like Susan, had to pay. And though the world painted him as the eternal teen heartthrob, behind the glitz was a man whose choices hurt those closest to him. Susan's story reminds us that fame doesn't protect you from betrayal. In fact, it often magnifies it. And what of her life since then? Susan Dey didn't just retreat from Hollywood. She reinvented herself far from the cameras. She channeled her experiences into private pursuits, keeping her world tightly protected. Unlike many of her peers, she didn't chase relevance through cameos or confessionals. She sought wholeness, not headlines. That choice extended to her financial life too. Susan Dey never flaunted her wealth, but behind closed doors, she built a portfolio that reflects understated elegance and sharp acumen. From her days on LA Law, she began diversifying early: real estate in Santa Monica, a discreet cabin getaway in Aspen, and investments in private eco-resorts in the Pacific Northwest. She once owned a vintage Aston Martin V8 Vantage, favoring timeless over trendy. Her watch of choice? A Patek Philippe Calatrava, elegant and unassuming. Unlike many celebrities who rented jets, Susan invested in fractional ownership of a Bombardier Global 6000, ensuring quiet, secure travel. Private jets and sharp real estate flips. He did it all, until it all came crashing down. His investments were bold but risky, and in later years, insurance on both his health and legacy may not have fully cushioned the fall. The lesson? It's not just what you earn, but how wisely you protect and grow it. That's a backstage pass to wealth building no one talks about. So, what did we learn from all this? That even Hollywood's brightest lights have shadows. That some reunions are better left as dreams. And that behind every glossy tabloid headline is a real person carrying the weight of choices, mistakes, and memories they can't always rewrite. If you felt something during this story, nostalgia, shock, maybe even a little heartbreak, let us know in the comments. Have you ever cut someone off to protect your peace? Or forgiven someone who didn't even say sorry? We want to hear it. Don't forget to like this video if you love uncovering the true stories behind the stars. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the drama beneath the glitter, and tap the bell. Because trust me, what's coming next? You won't want to miss it. We're diving into the biggest celebrity comeback you never saw coming. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, in a town obsessed with shining lights, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the stage.